Thank you all, and hopefully I actually recognize a couple of people, and I'm supposed to look into the light and stay in the light, so I promise I won't go too far into the light. And what I want to talk about today is really the whole spectrum of adolescent development. And the reason why I call it emotional intelligence and emotion regulation is because actually all of the processes, or many of the most important processes of adolescence, hinge on the development of the ability to identify and regulate one's feelings. So when people think about adolescence, they tend to think about adolescence as, come on guys, throw out some words. Moody. That's a good one. I hear that one a lot. What else? Hormones. Difficult. Isolated. Really? Nobody's like awesomely exploring their identity? Testing moments, rebellious. What I hope that you get at the end of this talk is a true appreciation of adolescence as an amazing time in our lifespan development. Not saying that adolescent behaviors are not challenging, most particularly to their parents. That's actually exactly how it should be. That's the point of adolescence. I hope you also walk away with an appreciation that the tasks that your child is going through that make you want to kill them are actually really important tasks that end up being the same framework that they use to develop a healthy, wonderful lifestyle, connections with other people, identifying their passions and their interests. And even though it may look like somebody just spun a random wheel on The Price is Right and they landed on like nutso for that day, or if you're really lucky, a good day, what they're really doing is learning how to manage their emotions and how to manage yours, because believe it or not, that's actually something we do with each other. So let's talk about adolescence. And so you guys threw some things out. I love this quote. Our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love chatter in the place of exercise. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents. They chatter before company, gobble up their food, and tyrannize their teachers. What was that?
Beginning of the 19th century.
Beginning of the 19th century? I would love to say yes, but you're so nowhere close. Any guesses? This is actually a quote from Plato. And this was before there was a period that we called adolescence. It was before the invention, if you will, of adolescence. And adolescence was really invented in around the mid-19th century. It was this notion that developed that actually children are precious and they're fragile and that they're inherently different than adults. If you look back, any of you guys frequent art museums and you look at pictures of little kids, there's a wonderful painting by Goya of a little boy holding a raven on a leash. I don't know why you'd have a pet raven, but why not? He also has 2 pet cats who are very interested in the pet raven. And this kid is wearing like this ruffle thing around his neck and a full velvet outfit, and he's standing kind of like, you know, the way you would if you were wearing a ruffle around your neck and a velvet outfit. I don't know about you guys, but I would never dress my child in velvet. I have an idea of what that would be like to clean. And we used to think that kids were like little adults and that we would have them do all the same things that adults did. They assumed those same responsibilities. We expected them to behave in certain ways. And it really wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we actually started to protect childhood. And from that actually came child labor laws and things like that. Anybody know what the first child abuse laws were actually prosecuted under? They were prosecuted under animal welfare rights. We actually had protection for dogs and cats against being hurt by adults before we had those for children, because we didn't actually discriminate children as a vulnerable population. Now, obviously, we've come a long way. And one of the ways that we've come a long way is that in addition to childhood, we've now added adolescence. And a lot of people, as evident by your sort of discussions about it earlier, think about adolescence as a period of storm and stress. You might have heard of this as Sturm und Drang. But I happen to think it's more fun than a barrel of monkeys. And I like monkeys, so there's not a tagline on there that you're not familiar with. And I don't think many people look at adolescence this way, because when we think about adolescence, we tend to think about a lot of the negative things. So what is adolescence? The Center for Disease Control actually defines adolescence as the period from 10 to 24, but for the sake of really wanting to hold on to the last 6 months of my child's childhood, I'm going to make it 12 to 24. Actually, the reason why I do that is because there are specific brain and emotional and hormonal changes that I'll be talking about that are really encompassed in this. But when I give you that range, 10 to 24, how many people are like, yeah, that was my adolescence? Did you guys think like maybe adolescence ended at like 18 and maybe there was something else that came after that? No. We've actually increased the amount of time that we refer to adolescence, and it's really been on that back end where we're encouraging people to think about their children as adolescents until 24, because most people are not actually ready to assume adult responsibilities until approximately that age. With the rapid increase in the last 50 years of people going to college, that's extended adolescence. And then if you think about all of the things that it takes to actually get a job and to become independent financially and otherwise, the Center for Disease Control has really extended that. And that's been actually wonderful for those of you who are parents of adolescents, because that's actually meant that your children actually can have health insurance coverage under you as long as they're going to school. And part of the way they did that was by saying, hey, look, this is a protected period of time. But adolescence is also a critical developmental stage. It is the bridge between childhood and adulthood, which means that the behaviors that you see across the range of adolescence vary widely. And if I were to tell you any one thing, and I'm going to tell you lots of things, is that what I'm going to be presenting today are broad brushstrokes. The variation within each of the areas that I'm going to talk about today for adolescence is enormous. If we even compare adolescent performance on standardized tests, for example, where we know what the average is, the range of behaviors that's considered average or typical for adolescents is about twice the size as it is for adults. And it's about 3 or 4 times the size that it is for children. So what we're saying here is that what's normal and what's typical is actually huge and very complex for adolescents. So how many of you read the book Charlotte's Web? Good, because most of you probably went to school in the States, and most people read Charlotte's Web around the time that they're learning to read. And so I'm actually going to start my discussion of adolescence by talking about how a pig, a spider, and an axe influence our thinking, friendships, and worldview. I choose Charlotte's Web because for most of us, we spend the first several years that we're in elementary school learning how to read. And I don't mean to offend any teachers, but it really is like starting from kindergarten on, you pay attention to the big person at the front of the room, you shut up when other people are talking, you sit down and you don't fiddle too much, right? We could kind of argue, and then we marshal their resources. When children are learning to read, someone else is telling them how to think about it or how to work it out. When we switch in that transition between 3rd and 4th grade, we start reading to learn. And that's when we get books like Charlotte's Web. So I'm just curious, those of you who've read Charlotte's Web, how many think this book is about a pig? What is wrong with you people? It's about a pig! How many of you think it's about a spider? How many of you don't remember? I remember this book very clearly because I had the same best friend from the time I was born until I was about 14. And you'll see why when we get to social relationships and 14-year-old girls. And I remember talking about this book, and I was horrified because if you don't remember the book, in the very first page, the scene opens with Dad taking a runt pig under his arm and an axe in his other hand, and he's going to take the pig and chop its head off. And I was like, who chose this book? Like, who thought this was a good idea? I've been an animal rights activist apparently since 4th grade. And I was horrified. And my mom finally calmed me down and got me to read the book. And I was talking about it with my best friend. And I was like, I love this book. I love this book. It's a book about a pig. And she's like, what are you talking about? It's a book about a spider. I'm like, no, it's a book about a pig. And she's like, it's called Charlotte's Web. It's about a spider. What was happening there was actually something really important. We were reading the same exact material and getting completely different opinions, ideas, emotional reactions. She did not remember that the dad wanted to off the pig. I hated the dad for the rest of the book. As far as I was concerned, he was no good. And yes, I fully recognize I love bacon too. But what was happening there was something that's really important when we think about development. In early childhood, what we are doing is developing the sense of I am an I. It was astounding to me that she and I could read the same book and have completely different views on it. And I realized that this information coming in and the way that I was interpreting it and what it meant to me and how I was connecting it, that was me. And I had different ideas, thoughts, values, and learning styles than my friend. Okay, granted, that last one I probably figured out in graduate school, but all the rest of it I really did figure out somewhere around 4th grade. And we spend that time when we make that transition where we're expected to do things independently, thinking about ourselves as someone different. When we move into middle school, which is the start of adolescence, however, something really amazing happens. We go from, and this is a hard one, my family lives in Palo Alto, and we have 21 children per classroom in elementary school, but my mother is a teacher in Los Angeles and she has 36. So we go from having between 20 and 35, 40 kids that we spend our time with, and 1 or 2 teachers who direct our activity, and 1 to 4 parents usually who direct our activity, to junior high schools, which on average in the United States funnel in 3 to 4 elementary schools. And all of a sudden you go from having this small sphere of influence to this huge sphere of influence. And you know what happens? The kids outnumber the adults. And if you have more than 1 child, you totally know what I mean, right? When all of a sudden you realize that like the best you're ever going to do is one-on-one, it's that moment when you realize the battle is already lost. And what happens is that these kids start to go through middle school, and it's not I'm an I, it's which I am I. And they start to learn something we call code switching. In other words, you don't talk to your mom the way you talk to your teacher, and you sure don't talk to your mom or your teacher like you talk to your friends, right? Because if you pulled that F-bomb with your teacher, she would send you to the principal's office, your mother would ground you, and your friends would be like, yeah. Right? And so you see this trying on of identities that happens in middle school. And then we do it again. Just when our kids get stable and they start to develop abstract thinking and reasoning, we throw them into high school, which is essentially 2 to 3 middle schools shoved together. And suddenly you have this catastrophic moment where the amount of hormones and amount of bodies that have control over those hormones are greatly outnumber the number of people who have the skills to manage that. And there's this huge peer culture that develops, and that's actually something really unique. It's happened in the last 50 years where we've moved from an appreciation of wanting to become adults. Do you guys remember when you were kids and you just wanted to grow up? And how old did you want to be? 20s? Yeah, now kids die to grow up to be teenagers. And after teenage years, you don't have the advertising dollars behind you anymore. So sorry to tell you, nothing's marketed at anybody in this room except for my son who's up in the back corner. He's still a marketable demographic. Everything is aimed at youth. And that actually happened in the 60s, which was kind of a cool time. And it was really, right, that was when if it was too loud, you were too old. Now I'm old and it's still too loud. Or sometimes not loud enough, depending on your hearing. The thing is that we switch to this place where it's not which I, it's how am I, right? And this is the period in high school. What do I like and how do I do things? So I want to walk you through that framework with these lectures by talking about development and why it matters on a global level, and then breaking it down by age groups and walking you through the cognitive, social, and emotional changes that kids experience. So when I talk about development, what I mean are the ways that our bodies, our brains, and our environments change. In addition, our contingencies change, and what I mean by that is what we're willing to work for, right? So when you were in 3rd grade, you might have worked for marbles in a jar in your classroom. I'm sort of guessing if I was your boss and I pulled out a marble jar and I was like, and when we're all quiet and focused on our work, you can earn a marble. And if we earn 50 marbles, we'll have an ice cream party. actually, now that I've said that, I'm like, that sounds awesome. But I'm guessing if your boss did that, you'd be a little annoyed and you'd feel a little infantilized. As we age, our contingencies, the things that draw us in and the things that push us back, change. But development never stops. We are continuing to develop. And it's not fluid. I would love to say to you that from the time we're little to the time we're grown up, we have this beautiful curve that goes like this, but that's not what happens. In fact, development is a series of fits and starts, and we'll actually talk about, in some ways, particularly during adolescence, there's a huge loss of skills. And this is something that's been documented in healthy adolescents as well as those who have certain difficulties, where really, if you were like, I think my child's lost half of their mind, the answer is yes, they have. They actually lose functioning as they get older and hopefully get it back. Development is varied even within age groups. I could not pick 5 12-year-olds that are similar to each other if I picked at random. In all likelihood, if I picked just sort of 5 12-year-old girls, even from the same school, there would be profound differences between them. And it also varies by gender and both within and across cultures. Boys and girls do not develop the same. That doesn't mean that they don't have the same endpoint, and some of this is driven by our culture, but actually on a biological level, development, especially cognitive development and development of the brain, are driven by different factors for boys and girls. So for women, did you know we get an adult brain by getting our period? When we start, the onset of menstruation is called menarche. From menarche on, we actually change the way the cells in our brains grow and develop. And for boys, that's not the case. Well, mainly because they don't get their period, right? But you're like, wait, what's that proxy? For boys, it's actually a more steady, slow, and linear development testosterone is important, and boys also have estrogen, but testosterone does not trigger the same kind of change. It's not the same linear change in development that we see in girls. So there are also differences there. And the other thing is that families change. The context in which you are raising your child changes constantly. You get older, you get sick, there are older or younger children. Your oldest child will enter adolescence differently than your younger child, if for no other reason than you might really actually already know what's coming and know how to pick your battles, versus with first children, we tend to make everything a battle, and they battle back even harder. So families are also changing context. So even within the same family, we may see differences. When I talk about cognitive development, I'm talking about both changes in the brain, structural changes in the brain, things that are happening, sorry about that, on the level of actually being able to image and understand the brain, as well as thinking styles, how we think, what information we choose to pay attention to. Now, in terms of structural change, the greatest structural change in your brain occurs between 0 and 5 years. Actually, in the first 2 years, when you're kind of born, you're born with all of the brain cells you're going to have, right? And they grow in, well, you can actually add more. We didn't know that. Even 10 years ago, we didn't know how plastic or how flexible your brain was. But what happens is those cells actually choose career paths in those first 2 years. They're like, I want to be a basal ganglia when I grow up. And somebody else is like, dude, I'm a frontal lobe. And they go and they migrate into their little places. And from about 2 until 5, your brain grows. And it adds in support cells and other things. And by about 5 years old, your brain is roughly the size and sort of structure that it's going to be. But then your brain hits about age 12, right? For girls, it's onset of menstruation. For boys, it's that slow increase in testosterone, where your brain actually changes the most in terms of function between 12 and 24. So if you're thinking that your child's lost their mind, in a lot of ways they have. What happens is they develop this myelin sheath. It's a fatty coating. And this fat coats every single cell in your brain. And just so you know, your brain cells go all the way down to your toes, right? They reach out and touch someone. And all of that, your brain gains about 1 pound of fat between 12 and 24, because your brain is actually the fattiest part of your body. It's about 70%, 60 to 70% fat. I know, you guys are like, huh? And why is your brain fat? Because that fat actually is an insulator, and cells within your brain communicate chemically between cells, but within a cell, it's electrically. And so what's happening here is actually the brain is actually changing in its process as well. connections between those brain structures are actually changing. You're developing something that we call tracts, which are, for each cell, if you want to imagine my body as a cell body where lots of cool stuff happens right in here, but all those cells reach out and touch one another. How many of your cells touch one another? We have more connections in our brain than all of the stars in the Milky Way, to the order of, more than the order of 10. You have literally trillions upon trillions of connections because each cell can reach out and touch many other cells. And those changes are happening, and guess what's happening? Most people are like, oh, your brain is getting bigger when you're an adolescent. No, actually, what's triggered is what we call apoptosis, or cell death. Your brain actually becomes an adult brain by losing cells. So remember when your mother was like, don't sniff glue, you'll lose brain cells. Okay, so she was actually right, but losing brain cells actually makes your brain more efficient. And what you practice during adolescence becomes the actual structure of your brain. And what I mean by that is you can change connections as you get older, but those actual connections, these huge tracts or arms of cells that are reaching out and touching one another, those develop during adolescence. And those are particularly important because those tracts, those long bundles of cells, are actually how you get rewards. So there's something called the ventral and striatal pathways, which are involved in rewards, motivation, attention, emotional control. And all of that happens in a part of your brain that's right up here called the frontal lobe. So while your brain never stops changing, the structural development, the reconstruction, if you will, or the I kind of think about it like a remodel. The remodel that makes it from a starter home into a grown-up home that happens during adolescence is critical. And this ties into emotional development because what you also see is increasing levels of emotion regulation and control. And these are related to thinking styles. You know how little kids are very grounded in rules? This is what I love about fifth graders. Fifth graders like rules. They want to follow rules. And when they think about the future, do they think about the future in any way that sort of makes sense to you? Right? Anything's possible for them. But they don't really lodge themselves well in the space-time continuum. Would you agree? How many of you have had a 13-year-old in your life, right? And they're like, oh my God, that was so last week. Like it was like back in the Pleistocene or something. And you're like, yeah, that was last week. Last week you told me this, and now it's no longer true. They're like, oh my God, you just don't understand me. And that's because one of the things that's happening is they're actually, as their cognition is changing, their emotions are changing. And what happens in part is, remember how I said cells communicate chemically between each other? Well, there are actually chemical systems that are still coming online or still developing during adolescence. And those are predominantly what we call your serotonergic system. How many of you guys have heard of Prozac? Woohoo, good, nice marketing. It's Pfizer, I think, right? So what happens with Prozac is what it does is it keeps serotonin active in your brain. And the serotonergic system, or the part of your body that relies on serotonin and develops serotonin, is actually coming online during adolescence. So let me just ask, when y'all have had a bad day, what do you guys want to do? Do you go home and go, hey, I really had a bad day. I want to go home and eat some red bell pepper slices? Now, why are you laughing at me? Nobody else does that? What do you do? Chocolate. That's a good one. And wine, that's another good one. Yeah, well, when you think of comfort foods, do you think of like salad? Nope. What do you think of? What are good comfort foods? Bread. Somebody said either fatty or fried, but I'll go with either of those. Yeah, chips, cookies, cakes, candies, pastries. Yes, Alex?
You already know what I'm going to say. So.
Lemon sugar crepes?
Yes.
Huh. And what I can tell you is all of those foods, the high-fat, sweet, carbohydrate-y, rich, yummy, delicious foods that we all love and that we think of as comfort foods, when they hit your large intestine, they form serotonin. And they do that at a differential rate than the foods that we might consider healthy and good for us. So have you noticed that like teenagers have this like overwhelming desire to eat crap? Well, that's actually a little bit boosting up that biological system. Okay? And serotonin has this wonderful mood regulating capacity. It keeps your mood from getting too up or too down. It contains anxiety, and it is also associated with feelings of what we call satiety, wholeness, wellness, and well-being. Doesn't everybody feel like now they want to go on Prozac? It just doesn't work that well. But that's one of the things that's actually happening in the adolescent brain is they're actually having to learn how to regulate this. And so you have two things that are coming together. The brain is a little less efficient, and the stuff inside the brain is changing. And all of these have an influence on attention, motivation, and self-control, of which emotion is a huge component. And then when we really think about what we think about as adolescents is we most often refer to social development, the ways we relate to others in our increasingly widening spheres of our social world. So let me give you an example of the ways in which development can influence things. Early sexual stimulation, by say early sexual abuse, actually stimulates the endocrine system to start menstruation earlier. So girls who have precocious puberty, early puberty, which can also be caused by endocrine difficulties and not just abuse for those of you who might have children who've had that, actually stimulates the onset of cell death or apoptosis at a much younger age before the brain is actually biologically ready and can actually create differences in the structure and function of the brain. There are also cultural expectations for maturity that influence early childhood behaviors. So some cultures give very little grounding in the first 5 years. I rather like these cultures. These are cultures where, like, for the first 5 years of a child's life, they're like little tyrants, right? They can get away with anything. And then somewhere around 5 or 7, they like start clamping down. And so by the time kids are teenagers, they're acting a lot like little adults. What's expected of us socially changes our behavior. What's expected of us culturally about emotional expression changes our emotional expression. We, in our culture here in America, watch a lot of Disney movies. And you know what the worst part about Disney movies are? They end just when it's getting good, right? If you think that the best part is getting Prince Charming instead of putting up with him for the next 40 years, then you've missed the really good part. Now, environment matters because all of you are sitting here based on something I'm going to call free will and choice. In other words, you have control over your environment. You have control over what you do and how you do it. And children don't. They live in the communities, go to the schools that their parents have chosen for them. They attend schools that have been chosen for them by their family for whatever those family reasons are. I'm not saying that this is bad, but it means that there's that lack of choice. And they're allowed access to friends and others based on parent expectations and rules. And part of what happens in adolescence is there's this increasing independence and autonomy, and I'll distinguish between those two in a little bit, where children actually get to start to choose these things. So I'm going to ask you, how many of you chose your friends because your parents liked them? How many of your parents tried to choose your friends because your parents liked them? Several of them. Sometimes, like when you got in a fight with somebody, your parents thought that was really good for you, they'd be like, so, have you made up with them yet? Why have you rejected them? We should invite so-and-so over, right? We're trying to push and shape and do all of that other stuff. But actually, the goal of adolescence is something we call niche picking. Niche picking means picking the environment that fits with our personalities and our interests and allows us to do the things where we're capitalizing on our strengths and either masking or working on our difficulties. So I know people never believe this about me, but I'm actually really, really shy. And I hate big crowds and like, woo. I'm okay here because nobody can actually, like, I'm hidden by the light. But like, I hate parties and stuff like that. And I'm married to somebody who thinks that that's like the most awesome thing ever. He would love to have parties every night. Well, I picked my career in part because I never had to interact with large groups of people. I would suck at that. Instead, I get to meet one-on-one with people and I get to learn from them, and I'm really social. I love interacting. I niche picked the environment that was good for me. I also went to UC Berkeley. Yes, I know, you can boo and hiss if you want, but I'm a house divided. And when we got there, my parents dropped me off in front of the school, and there was a man wearing women's lingerie with a camembert cheese strapped to his head with a belt. And I got out of our minivan, and I was like, I'm home! This is the environment I've been looking for! And my parents had a really quick behind-my-back conversation about whether or not they were going to throw me back in the van and drive me back to Los Angeles. But they recognized that this was my niche that I was picking, that in no way would they ever pick for themselves. Let me just say they were both really happy when I moved back to Northern California and was at Stanford. The thing is that these are not isolated influences, though. We've recently discovered, and by recently I really mean in the last 10 to 15 years, that environment and biology interact in a very complex way. You can actually turn your genetic code on and off. There are things that you do, or wires that you trip, or levels that you get to that cause a turn on in certain parts of your genes that either can or can't be turned off again. And as we mature, our environment can change our hormones, and those hormones can actually turn on or off certain parts of our genetic code. So some of us were really skinny until we got to a certain amount of estrogen and our body went, yeah, hips. And there was no turning back from that. It actually turned on a code that caused you to put fat around your hips instead of, I don't know, around your thighs or around your chest or around some other area. And I'm using sex hormones because those are really good examples, but there are other examples as well, and those can be things like nutrition. Those can be things like social relationships, and we're increasingly beginning to understand this idea of social neuroscience. What we feel, how we interact with our world, and what we do changes the way our brain develops, and this starts at birth. In the first 6 weeks of your child's life, they became sensitive to only hearing the smallest pieces of the language you spoke to them. It's what we call phonemic sensitivity. And that kind of sensitivity, this very subtle shaping of your brain and behavior, continues throughout your lifespan. And we're surrounded by these cultural and social influences that keep us on what's considered a normal or typical path. This is something we call canalization, and if you're interested, this is Bronfenbrenner's work. And what he said is that when we're doing things that everyone else around us are doing, and I put air quotes around the normal because what I really mean by that is sort of your cultural path or what your expectations are, if you start to stray from that, all of the forces in your world strive to push you back onto that track. Does that make sense to you guys? So the kid who's going to school is hanging out with other kids who are going to school. And if they're hanging out with kids who are doing their homework, when they don't do their homework, they're off the social norm, and their friends are like, how did you not do your homework? And then they have a choice. They're either going to pull their behavior in line with those kids who are keeping those expectations high, or they're going to get new friends who do what they do. But once we get off the normal developmental track, those same forces that are designed to keep us on actually disappear, and they're no longer at play, and they're replaced by contingencies that tend to keep us off the normal developmental trajectory. This is really important for you to be thinking about when you're thinking about adolescent development, because once your kid is skipping school and smoking pot and making friends with kids who skip school and smoke pot, all of those forces, like I'm afraid of the principal, or my friends might reject me, or my parents are going to be mad at me, those disappear and get replaced with influences that keep kids off those normal developmental trajectories. And increasingly, I said antisocial, I don't mean your child's going to turn into a sociopath, but I mean that they're going to be pulled back from those things. So common complaints that I hear are, my child is isolated. You know what? That's off the normal developmental path. They're no longer getting that social engagement that makes engagement fun. Or, my child wants to do whatever their friends are doing. Well, there's actually some really good literature suggesting that doing that can actually be in their best interest. Because the more they're doing what the kids in their social sphere are also doing, and believe me, I don't mean like having sex and smoking pot, I mean like going to movies that you might not pick for them, but that they pick for themselves. Like personally, like Paranormal Activity 4, you'd have to drug me to get me to go to that. But if you're between the ages of 14 and 16, you better have seen that movie. Yeah? Unless you have an anxiety disorder, in which case you can ignore that fact that I said that. But those are the things that people talk about at school. That becomes the language for connection for them and actually keeps them on that normal developmental trajectory. So what is normal for adolescents? Has anybody here ever Googled adolescent, like parenting help books on Amazon? I about died. I did this last night at midnight, just, I don't know, because I was obsessively trying to fix my presentation. And I had 23,516 results. There are books on things about adolescence that I didn't even know were adolescents. And there's a great book. I need to order this. I haven't read it, but it was like, yes, your teenager is crazy and why that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I was like, yes, finally, somebody's talking about it. So what is normal for adolescence? And then I'm going to tell you, my patients and the adolescents that I have the privilege of sharing their journey with helped me pick a lot of these quotes. They gave me ideas about what they wanted me to share with all of you. And so you'll see a lot of these come from a Tumblr site that I know is pretty popular with some of my kids. And one of the first things that we wanted to talk about with cognitive development has to do with being able to change your mind. And adolescence is a period where this ability to do what we call set shift, to change your mind, to multitask, to hold two things in your mind at the same time, actually becomes available to your adolescent for the first time. When you're younger, it's either good or bad. It's black or white. Adolescence actually opens up shades of gray. And so this was one of the quotes that they really wanted me to put up there. So what does cognitive development look like when you're 12 to 14? The focus is actually really beginning to develop abstract thinking. By abstract thinking, what I mean is imagining an outcome or result that's not tied to your reality. Actually being able to make it up out of thin air and project yourself into that sort of future. Abstract thinking means you are actually able to pull together disparate pieces of information to create a structural framework. And a lot of the time in early adolescence, you get really kind of funky thinking around abstraction, right? Have you guys ever had a conversation with your adolescent and it's going in a direction and you're like, yes, I get this, yes, I get this, and then they make a left turn at weird and they never come back to the road you were on? And it's like, I'll give you an example. My son said to me last night, you hate me, I know you hate me. And I was sitting there going like, in my life I've never hated him, but I'm trying really hard to think about like what I did that he didn't like that made him project onto me that I hated him, and my head exploded. And I just stayed quiet because I'm a psychologist. The other thing they're doing is beginning to develop a sense of themselves over time. So remember when I said kids don't lodge themselves well in the space-time continuum? I'm not actually really making a Doctor Who reference, although I do think it fits. When you are younger, and I don't know if any of you can really go back to this time, you can't imagine what life is really going to be like. Like how many people, when you were like 12 to 14 and thinking about what your life was going to be like, got anywhere close to what it looks like now? Everybody's shaking their head no at me. Can I ask this question? Because I actually really believe this. Like, I got it all wrong, like all of it. And I'm really happy about that. Like, just because it didn't turn out the way I wanted didn't mean it turned out badly. It just turned out differently. Kids are just starting to understand themselves. And one of the things we do as families, and this is a way that parents and families can really help their children, is we actually create anchor points for them in thinking about themselves. We actually create anchor points within a day, within a week, and within a year that helps kids develop a sense of themselves. So what do I mean by that? If you have family dinners together every night, A, good for you, B, you're protecting your children against all sorts of things you don't want, like teen pregnancy and school dropout, and you're also monitoring their eating and they're less likely to have an eating disorder. But also, you are actually giving them a cognitive point on which their day ends or rests. There's a consistency there that provides continuity that's actually important to their development of the sense of themselves. Now, how do we expand that to a week? How many of you guys have things in your lives like guitar lessons or cheerleading practices or tournaments or, chess? Those things anchor kids in a week. Oh, for me, I know my week, Thursdays is my easiest day. It's my research day, which means I just stop seeing patients. And I sit in meetings all day. But it's a different day for me, and I think differently on that day. Well, your kids do that on the weekend when you let them sleep in. Then the other piece of it, excuse me, is that they're also lodging themselves in time over a year. And families should have rituals about the things that we do. So it's getting close to the holiday times. Next week is Thanksgiving. How many of you have Thanksgiving rituals? Okay. Most people have sort of inherent ones like we serve turkey. My husband buys a tofu loaf every year, and every year no one eats it because nothing should look like that. Yeah, I know he tries to get you to eat it, but you never have, and you'd think he'd have learned by now. But he's still learning to develop his sense of self over time. Sorry, he's not here to defend himself, so I can take random pot shots at him. He's a great guy. But you guys also probably have rituals around the holidays. Like, if you're the kind of family who gets a Christmas tree, maybe you get it right after Thanksgiving when everybody's already together, or maybe you get it right before Christmas time, because who really needs more Christmas in their household? Or maybe you're like me and you just stopped getting a Christmas tree because it was decorated with cat, and that just wasn't kind of the holiday spirit you wanted. Those kinds of things anchor kids over time, and as they're able to extend this self, they can actually measure how they've changed. Families who have family pictures up on the wall do those kinds of things, and it actually gives you as a parent good touchstones to be paying attention to develop as well. But what we usually see in adolescence and what we pay attention to, because all brains are inherently negative and focus on negative behaviors, I'm hoping one of the things I do today is convince you to not do that, is that more extreme responses are actually more typical in adolescence. And by extreme, what I mean is adolescents are rarely neutral. Have you noticed that in your own life? There's like really good or it really sucks, but it's not that black and white thinking of a younger kid where it is or it isn't. It's either all reward or all punishment. And there's this increasing use of sarcasm as well. In other words, I can say something, but the way I say it changes its meaning. Late elementary school kids dig sarcasm. Middle school kids use sarcasm. Yeah, you're all like, God, do they ever? The other thing that happens is that they have an improved ability to tell lies, and sometimes increasing difficulty telling the difference between their lies, the things that are blatantly untrue, and their strong wishes for how they wish something would be. When I call this as a blurring of the lines of reality. And lest you think that that means they're psychotic, what it actually means is that your brain does not know the difference between dreams and reality. What it does and how it ties itself to reality is it uses physiological cues from your environment. So I know that I'm not just dreaming this, I know I'm doing this because I can feel my feet moving on the floor and there's a big light. That was not in my dream. Isn't it good that my anxiety dream lacked something that was going to cause me anxiety? You know, it's one of those things that you're doing, your feeling of your butt in the seat is helping you actually lodge this in reality, and that's what our teenagers are learning how to do, and they're just not as good at it. This is also why they can say one thing to your face and absolutely turn around the next minute and not do that. You know what I'm saying? Or do the exact opposite if you're really lucky. And that's because they're able to start to manipulate things in their mind. What you see in 12 to 14-year-olds are also more frequent identity changes. My favorite story, I have friends, they're both psychologists, and they live in England outside of London, and their daughter went on a school trip to London. She was 13, and she said to them, I'm going to use all of my spending money, and I'm going to buy all goth clothing, and I'm going to come home and dress in all black. And because they were psychologists, they were like, mm-hmm. She came home with a teddy bear from Harrods. And that's where she had spent all of her money. And to me, that is the sweetness and wonderfulness of that 12 to 14-year-old age where they kind of want one thing, but then it's like squirrel, and they get distracted and they end up doing something else. And they're that sweet mix of better and worse. And remember how I said there are gender differences? In 12 to 14, we start to see greater impulsivity and risk-taking in girls, but not in boys. Boys seem to still have that sort of 10 to 12-year-old level of impulsivity. So what you see in girls is a little different. What it is risk-taking for girls tends to be more physical, right? I'm going to change my hairstyle, I'm going to change my dress, I'm going to change my friends, I'm going to listen to different music. And it also appears as social drama. Now, what happens in 15 to 16-year-olds with their brain? They actually have really good abstract thinking, and they can also use symbolism. So younger kids can't do that. They can't have something stand in or represent something else in the same way. So what you see for your 15 and 16-year-olds is they'll adopt a cause, or they will adopt an identity. What they're doing, their physical self, often manifests what they want you to know about them. And they have a stronger sense of self over time. And often what you're seeing is a recognition both in themselves and in you of them of more stronger and stable personality traits. I love sophomores in high school and sophomores in college because really they're not that different from one another. Sophomores in high school are incredibly idealistic and passionate. These are the kids who become vegetarians because how could you not, right? And sometimes for our slightly less mature kids, it's really just like, because I like animals. And then for some of the more sort of impassioned ones, it's like, and this is going to stop greenhouse gases, and this is going to do this. You see this explosion of interest also in the social world. And this comes across as very opinionated, impassioned, stubborn, idealistic. And a lot of the times this means arguing. You guys kind of know what I mean? This is like you say, the sky is really blue. Well, it's not actually blue. It's really just blank, but what's happening is your eyes are filtered, and you're like, oh my God, I did not need a physics lesson, thank you very much. And where girls have sort of bottomed out at 15 and 16 on impulsivity and risk-taking, boys leapfrog them. So I always say, Alex, plug your ears, that my son would never, at this age, he's 11 and a half, run off the curb to get a basketball that went into the street. He simply would not do it, and he hasn't done that for years. I know it doesn't even cross his mind. However, when he's 16, I fully expect him to do something incredibly stupid, like tie himself to the back of a moving vehicle while he sits on a skateboard and goes down Skyline Boulevard, and he is going to think that this is the most brilliant thing he has ever come up with. Unless you, and that's where parents are kind of like, oh my God, they missed something. What actually happens, and I'm not at all kidding you, is there's this beautiful U-curve of development for your brain, and the skills you have when you're 10 that are secure around risk-taking and impulsivity completely disappear by the time you are a 14-year-old boy or a 15-year-old boy. You actually regress, and that has to do with the way the brain is developing. When we're little, our brain is developing from the inside forward, and the frontal lobes, this part right here that makes us uniquely human, is the last part to develop. And what's happening is girls have a lot more social controls. Believe it or not, part of the difficulty with girls and why their behavior can seem all over the place is they have a lot of external controls on their behavior, where boys have more internal controls on their behavior, or lack thereof. And what's happening is the part of the brain that's sort of the midsection of the brain is going, I got it, and the frontal lobe is like, no, it's my turn, I got it, and neither of them got it, and the kid does something really, really dumb, and you're like, no one was driving that boat. So this is what my teenagers wanted you to see. If anyone could read my mind, I'm pretty sure they'd be traumatized for life. Now, when we get to 17 and 18, what you start to see, thankfully, is greater stability. Greater stability in all aspects. The brain is finishing up and fine-tuning its pruning and development. There's greater stability in identity formation, and usually stronger and more consistency in friendships and pursuits. By the time your child is 17 or 18 and getting ready to choose college, they're going to worry about all of these things. But they should know these things. What I say is you need to know about yourself, and if you don't at this age, you should. Are you an indoor person or an outdoor person? Do you like groups or do you like one-on-one? And a lot of you are like going, it depends. That right there, being able to say it depends, is abstract thinking. It is all of the things that your child should be doing, and they should be thinking about what kind of environment do I want to build for myself. So I happen to be an outdoor person. I really like going out and doing fun things, and I would rather spend my vacation kayaking than I would in a spa, although right now that sounds really good. So I guess my answer is it depends. I like a job that's actually pretty steady and consistent because too much change whacks me out. Your child should know whether they want to go to a school that's big or a school that's small. If part of what they imagine their college experience being is going to a huge football game with a lot of people, they should probably go to a school with a football team. And some of you are laughing, but I see teenagers every day of the week, and they come in and they're like, I really want to go to Sarah Lawrence and go to a football game. And I'm like, well, that'll be a cold day in hell, because there's not one. And so they need to help thinking through these things. Instead of expecting them to have the answers, you should help them ask the questions. The kinds of things they need help with are thinking about the bigger picture. Hey, guess what? If you guys choose something and you don't like it, what do? Change it or learn how to put up with it. That's a good one too. But most of the time, like if you pick wrong, you can pick again. And teenagers need help remembering that because we kind of suck at telling them that. We tend to put them on a path where they think what they're doing at 18 is what they're going to do for the rest of their life. So show of hands, how many people at 18 are doing what they thought they would be doing? Yeah, there are 2 of us. That's actually one more than there usually is in the room. They also have a lot of regrets, reconciliations, and rewards. The second semester of senior year of high school is usually my favorite for these kids because all the kids that they've spent 3.5 years hating, all of a sudden they kind of feel nostalgic for. And they might even feel nostalgic for you, if you're really lucky. I lump together 19 to 24 because this is sort of that moving out of the house and developing independence. Most adolescent development specialists would probably make this between 19 and 20 or 21 and 21 to 24. But really, I think all of these fits. What you see is another return to idealism or hopelessness, right? So sophomores in college look a lot like sophomores in high school, except for they're more humble. Right? So 15-year-olds are all bravado and awesomeness, and they're going to change the world, and they actually really think that, and 19-year-olds are just a little bit more pragmatic. There's greater coherence in their thinking styles. You actually kind of know when they're coming at you with information what path it's going to go down. They actually are thinking more consistently, and there's greater overlap. So like, I work with a lot of teenagers who are things like, I am completely pro-death penalty. And I'm also pro-choice, and I'm also, and you're kind of like, wait. The 2 things that you were choosing there are like, the reasons behind them are sort of fundamentally opposed. They're like, all life is sacred, but you should put people to death who do bad things. And I'm like, can we think about that for a little while? 19 and 20-year-olds think differently. They're able to say, yes, I know these 2 things kind of don't go together, but here's how, or here's my logic. It's more fleshed out. And they have a more coherent sense of themselves and their opinions on things. There's a gravitation towards specific experiences or styles of learning. So most of you have come here tonight because you don't actually mind having somebody talk at you for an hour and a half, right? But that's maybe not how your child learns. Your child may actually have to learn by like running into a wall multiple times before they figure out how to scale it. The other thing is that they're much more tied to reality. Like I said, more pragmatic. And there's an integration of the self and society and an increasing outward focus. And what I mean by this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, is 15-year-olds are very concerned with what the outside world thinks about them. 19-year-olds are very concerned with what the outside world thinks. Do you get the difference? One is a lens on the self, the other is a lens outward. When we talk about social development, I like this one. Party hard, make mistakes, laugh endlessly, do things you're afraid to do. After all, you're only young once. And what I really love about this is I feel like that's my motto now, and nobody that I work with thinks I'm young. They all think I'm really, really old, which is awesome because I just turned 40. And they are so right. I am really old compared to them. And I have a lot more experience, but I think that what's inherent in this that they really loved was the whole idea that doing things to extreme, which we often try to hold our adolescents back from, can actually be really important in understanding your limits. The other thing that they tell me all the time is that it's not okay to make mistakes. And I really want you to think about that. Is that a message that you bring home to the adolescents in your life? Because if it is, you're taking away the most important learning factor that we all have, which is spectacular failure. I fail more often than I am successful, and I am happy to fail because it tells me where I need to change things to be successful. Adolescents need to hear repeatedly that it's okay to make mistakes. And this is important both socially and in other ways, cognitively, on math tests. And here's what I say to families all the time. I think it's really important. My favorite thing about being a therapist is that when I make a mistake, and I do every day, you're going to come back to me, and I'm going to be able to make it right. This is also my favorite thing about being a parent, because God knows I've lost my kazoo more than a few times with my kid, and then afterwards you're like, I cannot believe I said that. Like, has anybody else had that parenting moment? I'm not really trying to just shame myself. We've all had it. And once you've had that, some of us try to pretend like we didn't do it, right? I've done that a couple times. I'm like, we'll just pretend that didn't happen. And what we really need to do is actually approach our children and say, you know, I was really out of bounds last night. I got really mad and I said things that I probably shouldn't, and I'm kind of guessing you did too, because if you really meant to call me a psychotic bitch, we have a problem. And so let's talk about it now when we're not emotionally engaged. So what does ages 12 to 14 look like with social development? I call this the great exploration. What you see at this age is a huge variability in friendship groups, styles, issues that are important, grounding mechanisms. If your child had really great friends that they went to middle school with, in all likelihood, those kids will not be their friends when they graduate from middle school. And this can feel to parents like a huge loss. It is very hard for us as parents to watch our children go through cycles of rejection, or sometimes even worse, being the rejecter. It's hard to watch them give up the things that we've thought have made them themselves, but it's actually really important, because what children are doing at this age is learning how to view themselves from a lens of the other. And so they are trying on different personalities. Right now there's a huge, I don't quite know what to call it. I'm at a loss for words, but cutting is like really common, and it freaks parents out. It should freak you out. But sort of estimates that are coming in are suggesting that about 60% of teenagers between the ages of 12 and 15 cut. If 60% of people are doing it, that's not an abnormal behavior. Some kids do it just a little bit, some kids do it a lot. This is one of the great explorations that's happening. Other people are doing it, I'm gonna try it. My friend said that this helps them control their emotions, so I'm gonna do it. Sometimes I think about this like lemmings. What cutting is? It is self-injurious behavior where kids are using fingernails, implements, tools, knives, other things to cut their skin. Bleeding in particular tends to be the goal. Some kids will also burn, or another one that's quite popular now is self-asphyxiating behavior. Sorry, that one's a hard one for me to get out, where you choke yourself until you faint. Emotion regulation, cutting is an emotion regulation strategy. And so you start to see the way peers begin to influence behaviors and choices that might never have occurred to you. The fact that I had to define cutting to you, where amongst teenagers, everybody knows what that is, and everybody knows somebody who does it. I used to not talk about cutting with kids who were in middle school, but now I just can't do it. I have to ask them, because most kids have been exposed to it. So what happens in middle school, do you guys remember this, where you'd like get a stain on your shirt and you would think that everybody noticed the mustard on your collar? Do you kind of remember those days? And now that you're older, like, do you notice mustard on people's collars? I'm like, hey, I bathed. I'm doing great today. What happens when we're younger is we turn this lens outward and we think that everybody is looking at us with the critical eye that we are looking at ourselves with. It's what I call the social chorus, or the Greek chorus. Do you remember that from when you used to read, ancient Greek literature, and they had this group of people who would travel around on the stage and give you moral messages? Except for one thing, our social chorus is never nice. It's rarely like, you look hot. Okay, your social chorus says things like, your butt looks really big in those jeans. And he was thinking that when he walked by. And so your social chorus becomes this sort of observing ego. What we see in girls as being different from boys is girls are much more social. They're much more competitive. That's something that often doesn't come up in elementary school, that starts socially. The social competition urges really kick up between 12 and 14. And they're strongly comparative. 12 to 14-year-old girls will compare everything about themselves to everyone. They may compare how much they eat to how much you eat, how much you spend on your shoes to how much their friend's mom spends on their shoes, what kind of car you drive. And they're socially violent. Do you guys understand what I mean when I say that? Boys will often just punch you in the face if they don't like you. 12-year-old girls will eviscerate your soul. And they will do it in a public forum where you want to die. Dads often have a really hard time with this because they don't understand that sort of social competitiveness and other things that develop. For girls in particular, there's a very strong sense of social striving and social position. And that's true even if your daughters are in sports, although that is a bit of a protective factor. There's a very strong hierarchical nature to relationships, and you may find your 12 to 14-year-olds trying to figure out where they fit. What I always say to parents is, never underestimate the importance of where your daughter eats lunch, okay? Where they sit at which table, what they eat, because quite frankly, just in case you didn't know, most middle schoolers, females, are not eating lunch. I don't care what they tell you, they're not eating lunch. And in fact, there's a huge amount of pressure to not eat lunch. And so those things are actually important to them, and you might be like, okay, that doesn't seem that important to me. But 12 to 14-year-old boys are still kind of cute and cuddly for the most part. They may start to become more socially vicious in that they'll reject kids who were overt outliers, and if your child is an overt outlier, they will know it by 7th grade. But they're not the same kind of demeaning, mean, harping evilness that girls have. And I love my teenage girls. They're just not nice because it's all downward social comparison, right? It's about, and you as parents, you're embarrassing because you breathe. Right? I know you know what I'm talking about. It's like, why couldn't you be more like so-and-so's mom? And you're like, what do you like about her? She's not a very nice person. We golf together. No. But you're embarrassing because everything about you is wrong. They don't want to have anything to do with you, and they don't want anything to do with you because it's an important part of how females develop a sense of identity. If, as a mom, you are more attractive than you should be, in other words, other people find you attractive other than your spouse, and quite frankly, if your spouse finds you attractive, your kid's not going to like that either. If you are too hip or too cool, then other people notice you instead of noticing your child, which is they don't like. And God forbid you're not any of that stuff, and then you're like ugly, loud, embarrassing, fat. They're very vicious personal attacks because your child feels like they are supposed to bask in your reflected glory. So you can't win either way. Here's my suggestion: don't try. It's not a playing field you really want to be on. It's actually not a playing field you want your adolescent to be on. One of the things that we have to do with our kids is really help them at 12 to 14 remember that what they're doing and how they're doing it still maintains certain boundaries. And so you're better off just saying, well, thank goodness your friends aren't my friends if they think that I'm too loud, listen to bad music. I mean, you fill in the blank. There's also increasing interest in 12 to 14 in sexual interest and peers as sex and love interests. And this is one of my favorite quotes and this is my 12 to 14-year-old snapshot of social relationships. My level of maturity changes depending on who I am around. Social development at 15 to 16, I call preening the peacock. The goal is moving from I'm standing out because how I dress and who I hang out with is my personality to standing out without drawing attention. And you'll notice this shift. Everything becomes a little bit more subtle, and they even become more subtle in the extremes. So if your child is adopting a more extreme sort of punk rock or hip hop, they sort of tie it in a little bit and rein it down. And the other thing they do is what I call feathering the nest, which is finding ways that they can be the same as or better than others. So in 12 to 14-year-olds, it's just sort of this global, I need to be better than, I have to be invincible and invulnerable, and I'm really masking this intense vulnerability that I'm not good enough. 15 to 16-year-olds are like, I'm really good at this, and they're okay having that more narrow framework. And so what you see with girls is that they're continuing to be socially cutthroat, but they settle away from some of that more overt drama of the teen years. Depending on the age of your child, I actually find that texting is a good way to sort of measure your child's social ability. 12 to 14-year-old girls, the amount of texts and Facebook and all that other stuff that they receive, it's absolutely unfathomable how many discrete pieces of information about random people that your child is taking in. And what you'll see around 15 or 16 is they may keep that same thing, like I have 12,000 friends, most of whom I've never met. but they'll only pay attention to information from some of them. They will decrease the number of people that they're texting at 2 in the morning to maybe 5 people instead of 50 people. And they don't need to know and constantly update how they're doing in the social world because they move that cue a little bit more in. And as your girls are starting to get a little bit more stable, your boys, unfortunately, the floor drops out. So girls, everything widens. Boys, the floor falls out. And what happens is boys lose that ability to speak, right? How are you? Yeah. They develop anger issues a lot of the time. You see this kind of explosiveness, this rage. Often it's very physical, and their physicality is changing quite dramatically, actually. Between really 14 and 16, they're going through their growth spurt. They're laying down their adult musculature. Their brain is developing. And they tend to not look at you ever, right? And it's like, why won't you? Sometimes I'm like, you know, like, come on. And they're like, can't look at you. And you're like, what's the deal? Other parents also notice that the sexuality is really big, and that's often a reason for withdrawal of boys, is the uncontrollability of sexual development for boys is quite challenging. And it's especially difficult to discuss with mothers because there's really not a language that any 14 to 16-year-old boy has for wet dreams. Nocturnal emissions, that's going to be okay to discuss with you. But it's really important, and I really mean this. I'm not saying that kids should date. Those are your rules. But by the time they're 16, they should know what they like. They should be able to identify it. And there should be someone in the surrounding sphere of their universe, someone ideally in the continental United States, that they find attractive and would want to be in a relationship with. If your 16-year-old is still saying, hey, I'm just really not interested, I'd start to worry a little bit. That's not typical. They should be knowing this stuff. And establishing a sexual identity is a critical social goal because you are going to be defined and pigeonholed by this for a lot of the rest of your time. So issues of heterosexuality and homosexuality arise, but also just issues around sexuality. Are you the kind of kid who holds hands or not? And sexuality for girls is much more fraught than it is for boys. Because for girls, you have 2 things you can be, a virgin or a slut. And I'm sorry, but those are really truly your options. We do a huge disservice in the sexual development of girls. And that's a real problem. Versus for boys, I'm just going to tell you, any sexual activity makes you a better man. The other thing I've discovered is in terms of sexuality, everybody was getting more than I was in high school. And my beliefs have been confirmed. Between 15 and 16, levels of sexual behavior increased dramatically. And I mean dramatically. So I want you to be prepared that by 16, the average American teenager is having sex. And by 17, they've had multiple partners. Sexuality covers a broad range of behaviors, but there's not a lot that's not available to them. And so that actually becomes a way of being evaluated by peers. I love this because so many parents feel disempowered by being 18. When I turn 18 and my parents try to get me to do something, I'll just be like, Dobby has no master. Dobby is a free elf. If you guys know who that is, that's from Harry Potter. How many people are scared of age 18? Like you feel like you're going to lose control, they're going to be able to make decisions without you. I meet a lot of parents who are really worried about that. And then I remind them, you pay for everything. Never be afraid of 18. Social development, I think I might have gone, nope. Social development 19 to 24 is really different, and a lot of this is going to happen outside of your awareness. This is learning how to develop relationships independently. You no longer foster them, and quite frankly, they're no longer fostered by what we call propinquity. A lot of the time when we're making friends early in our life, we're making them because they are around. They go to school with me, they're on my soccer team, we had common interests, we do the same things, we grow up in the same neighborhood. And then you go to college and there are 35,000 other people that you then need to make a relationship with. And how you decide and how you learn how to engage people in different roles becomes really important. And the other thing that we begin to develop that's not as manifest in high school is the difference between our social persona and our private persona. right? I'm guessing you are not the same person on your couch or with your close friends as you are right now. I am also not. And then the other major goal here is love, developing, and by love I don't just mean sexual love, I mean really strong feelings that bound us over time, connect us to people, and help us worry and develop concern about their best interests regardless of how that impacts us. And so I love this quote from Dr. Seuss. We're all a little weird and life's a little weird. And when we find someone whose weirdness is compatible with ours, we join with them and fall in mutual weirdness and call it love. I took the top 5 quotes that I found to talk about emotional development from a teen blog that is actually designed for positive teen communication. Literally, these were random. These were ones that I just pulled off, and I pulled them off indiscriminately. Life is like Facebook. People will like your problems and comments, but no one will solve them because everybody is busy updating theirs. How about this one? I have tears rolling down my face. You hug each other, but not me. I can't believe you don't see how broken I really am. I have to tell you, if I hear one thing from teenagers, it's that they're very afraid that no one sees how vulnerable they are, and that in particular, their parents and their friends can't see how vulnerable they are. We live in a culture where we pathologize vulnerability, and we very much admire strength and stoicism, and I think that sometimes is a real disadvantage to our kids. My problem is I care way too much about people who don't really care about me. And you might notice that your teenager judges how much someone cares about them by what they do for them. Have you noticed that sometimes in your teenage household you become very functional? I call it Funktionslust, which actually refers to a German period of like design and development where things are supposed to be beautiful and functional, but I think it really fits. Like, you did my laundry and you washed my favorite shirt without asking. I love you. That sad moment when you realize the trash goes out more than you. And this is also an important part of social development for teenagers because what happens that's valuable often happens outside of the house. And this one, which I think really speaks to love, you don't know how bad I want to say I miss you, but I know it won't change a thing, so I'll just keep pretending I don't. And if you can get past the really bad grammar and figure out what they're saying is that that notion of being able to connect with others is really important, especially in romantic relationships. And we'll talk for a second about that because for emotional development, it seems like a regression and not a development. Remember how I said the brain actually loosens those controls in some area and tries to develop more control in others? That means there are actually stronger engines. There's greater breadth and depth of feeling, but the driver's asleep at the wheel. No one's actually helping steer that ship because, you know, the midsection of your brain and your frontal lobes are just not communicating well together. And the effect that that has is an increase in what we call the intensity of emotions as well as the lability of emotions. So what I mean by that is most of us have feelings and we have strong feelings. In adolescence, the strength of our feelings increases. You actually feel things more intensely, and that's both on the good side and the bad side. So remember when I started by saying, is this a period of storm and stress? Many people have thought so because they see their child developing stronger negative emotions, but your child's also developing stronger positive emotions. And then they're more labile. And by labile, what I mean is they move up and down on that frequency of emotions much more quickly, right? Sometimes you sort of feel like, okay, she was in a good mood, and then her face turned around, and then she turned around again, and she was in a bad mood. What is that? That's emotional lability. And part of the reason why adolescents are more labile is because they are taking in information from more places than you are. How many of you check your Facebook status and updates as often as your teenagers do? And why not? No time. I actually have to say there's an element for me of I really don't care. Like, I'm like, wow, you checked in at Envy Spa. I'm envious. But this is actually really important to your kids, and they use it to determine their mood. So what you want in emotional development is a lovely bell curve, but what you really get is that sane to crazy, boring versus interesting. And I like this one because it's all Jims. So you've got Jimmy Carter, and then Jimmy Stewart, and then Jim Henson, which I thought was really interesting because he's kind of the top of the bell curve between boring and interesting, sane and crazy. It's like something about those Muppets. And then you get to like Jim Morrison and Jim Jones, and you get closer to like boring and crazy. But this is kind of a good example of what your teenagers are doing. Their emotional development is not the same as yours. The major tasks of adolescence are learning how to do what we don't want to do, right? When your alarm goes off in the morning, do you ever want to get up? Right? That's why God invented the snooze button. How to stop doing what we want to do when it's not the right time. So I would much, just so you know, and no offense meant by any of this, much rather would have spent an hour longer at dinner because somebody else was cooking it than, going back to work or just sitting in traffic. But sometimes we have to stop doing what's fun and do what we have to. We have to learn how to reward ourselves for getting it right more often than not, right? And how many of us are good at that? Most of us kind of still stink at that. By not doing, right? So if we're not, as long as what we're doing to reward ourselves doesn't hurt others, because we also need to learn how to be nice or nicer to other people. That's a huge change that happens over adolescence to adulthood. You do not tell other people what you really think of them all of the time. Thank goodness, or you would be really unhappy. Sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we can't stop ourselves from making the wrong choice, and then we have to learn how to avoid the situations in which making the right choice is difficult. You kind of know what I mean? I'll give you an example for me. Halloween, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, the mini ones, they're like Satan's spawn, especially when you put them in the freezer and then they call to you at night. And whenever somebody opens the freezer, they're like, eat me. So I just don't buy them anymore. Because I did. And then the other thing is learning how to be effective with others. The skills that we do this are what we call emotion regulation skills. Emotion regulation is the term that we use to regulate the temperature of our emotions. And these can take on several different aspects. There are coping strategies. These are things that we do to keep ourselves from feeling worse than we otherwise would. Yeah? Most people tend to think about coping as feeling better, but those are actually happiness and protective strategies. Often once you feel badly, your goal should be to find something that's not going to hurt yourself or others, that's going to make you not feel worse. Happiness developing strategies, as a society we kind of stink at these, but these are things like finding a path that's joyful, demonstrating gratitude, spending time doing things that make us feel good on purpose on a regular basis. How about this one? Disappointment control strategies, right? A lot of teenagers tell me things like, I have no expectations, so I'm never disappointed. And I'm like, really? Because I find that my disappointments just surprise me. I'm never prepared for them, because if I was prepared for them, they wouldn't disappoint me. It's the things that jump out and bite you in the butt that you totally weren't expecting, where you're like, oh, heart-crushing moment, didn't see that coming. So we actually have to have strategies for what we do when we're disappointed. I am not saying to court disappointment. That would make me a really bad therapist, and it would also completely contradict the second goal that I just gave you. But let me ask you, how many people here have been disappointed before? Especially really, really badly. How many of you have survived? And how many of you, when you really think about the disappointments that you've experienced, recognize that there's actually a flow to it? That once you're disappointed, you might have a way of managing that. Maybe, if you're like me, you isolate, and for a little bit you just kind of sit in your little crown of shame, and you're like, ooh, that really sucked, and I don't want to do that. And then you pick something you are going to do, and maybe you go out there, and then maybe you share your shame with a couple of other people, and they try to protect you from disappointment, and then you find something else that interests you, and then you're done. Yeah. Most of us spend so much time trying to avoid disappointment that we forget to walk our kids through disappointment and remind them of all the skills and strengths they used to manage it before. This is your job. You understand adolescence. You understand the child in front of you better than anyone else. Actually, sometimes better than they do, but they will hate you for saying that, so it may never be uttered out loud until they're 30. And it's your job to remind them of those skills and strengths that they could use. And that is where learning and problem solving come in. Most of us, by the time we've hit adolescence, have great problem solving skills. You know what we lack? The ability to think that if we use them, they'd be effective for us. Have you ever had teenagers be like, I'm great at giving advice, I'm just terrible at following it? The reason why they don't is a lot of adolescents lack what we call self-efficacy or problem-solving orientation. They know what to do. They don't believe that it will work out for them if they do it, or they believe that for some reason that skill's not going to work for them. And so motivation being part of this, a lot of you are like, and let me just ask, how many of you outgrew this? Probably not as well as we would like. And I love this slide because it was actually, this was one that when it came up, one of my teenagers said to me, you know, my parents are such hypocrites. They expect me to do everything on time and do it perfectly and do it well because that's what's expected of them. Like, I don't see them running around getting butter right before dinner because they forgot and they didn't have what they needed. Or how many times my mom has just been like, well, that's just not going to happen because I didn't plan for it. And they're like, and when I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen because I just didn't plan for it, my mom's like, don't talk back to me, you're going to do that. Just know that the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, yeah, didn't work then and it doesn't work now, and they're watching you. Instead, what we have to do is recognize that some of the time they're doing things that we do, they're just doing it in a way that annoys the living daylights out of us because every parent wants their child to suffer differently than they did, right? That's actually probably why you went out and mated with somebody who was not a family member. I mean, besides the fact that it's illegal in most states. The reason why we actually develop socially and go out and mate with other people is so that we don't like create a catastrophe of badness in our genetic potential, right? And so when you left your family and you were like, dude, none of them, don't mate with them, they're crazy. And you got together with somebody who's crazy, either you understood or was different than you're crazy, right? And then you made a baby and you thought, my kid's gonna have, well, this is what we say in my household. My son was supposed to have my husband's eyes and my teeth. But what we weren't prepared for was that his neurosis and my neurosis were going to go boom. And you have to be aware that sometimes what you're trying to protect your child from is you and what you've suffered and what you've felt or what you do now that you don't like. And it's really important instead to have a conversation about that, how that's become your skill, your strength, your drive, or something you're actively working on. So what does emotional development, and I'm going to talk faster because now I'm really out of time, look like in ages 12 to 14? For girls, it's, again, increasing range of emotions of all types, greater lability and mood changes, greater intensity of emotions. And so this is also known as, I think my daughter's gone crazy. Like she was totally normal and now she's really, really not. And it's correlated with a really messy bedroom. If your 12 to 14-year-old daughter goes from having a relatively neat bedroom to one that requires hazmat materials, she's doing her adolescence pretty well. Okay, that's actually not a bad thing. Boys tend toward more stereotypical or hypermasculine behaviors. You see some increased intensity of emotions or some more moodiness, but it's generally more fleeting than it is in girls. What we tend to see is increasing levels of what we call amotivational behavior in young adolescent males. And so it's correlated with an insatiable appetite for peanut butter and video games. This is the age where kids getting sucked into video games and not being able to stop become a critical area. And that's for boys much more so than girls, because remember, for girls, the social rewardingness, literally on a biological level, comes from external to them, where for boys it's still internal. Ages 15 to 16, what you find for girls is continued high levels of lability and intensity, what parents often refer to as, we're walking on eggshells. We never know what's going to set our child off. And it's correlated with that, I can't believe you did that, kind of the voice that like makes you want to give them anything so that it stops happening. Lots of demands, requests, whiny, repeating things over and over again. Rumination, right? Going over the same thing over and over and over again as though talking about it for the 50th time is going to change it. Have you ever listened to your daughters on the phone and they're like, and then he said this. No, he said it this way. He said, I don't want to. Well, no, I mean, it might have been, I don't want to, but I'm not sure. And what do you think that means? Well, what if he said it, maybe I heard it wrong, and maybe it was like, I don't want to, but does that change it? I mean, do you think that means he doesn't want to? Is he ever going to like me? And you're like, oh my God. And what's happening there is that girls are developing this over social control, right? And that's what creates this lability. They're still very vulnerable to things happening around them, and they're trying to make sense of the subtleties of social communication without having realized that nobody else cares. This is the best gift of adulthood, right? That you figured out that no one thinks about you as much as you think about you. And the more they love you, the less they think about you, like when you're going to the bathroom or writing in your journal. For boys, what you have is a decreased ability to listen, speak, and respond. And I'm trying to be nice here, but really what you get is increasing gruntingness. And you will think that they are listening, and then when you ask them to repeat it, they don't have the first clue what you're talking about. And there's more intensity of emotion, but often less lability. So boys are not as up and down as girls are. They tend to just have a floor dropout. And this is when parents start saying to me, oh, well, he's definitely a teenager. And I really actually think that I call this like the regression back to the Cro-Magnon man, because they have about the same vocabulary level and about that same appetite. And so most of their days are taken up by sleeping, eating, possibly playing sports. And this is actually a quote from one of my patients who asked me to post it. She said, "So please just be patient. I'm so afraid to care about someone. I know it seems like I'm a strong girl who can get through anything, but inside I'm very fragile. I've had so many things thrown at me, and each one has only made a crack. What I'm afraid of is shattering." And when we talked about it, I think what she came up with was really wise. And that is, at this point in time in your lives, you've experienced many, many things. You've probably moved. You've had friends who've died. You've had friends who've come into your life. You've had wonderful, happy surprises. You've had education. You've had failures. You've had all of these things, which have given you mad skills. Everything your adolescent is doing, they're doing for the first time. And if you really think about the first heartbreak, the first move, the first change, the first independence, the first everything, they're not as facile in handling it as you are. Do you remember when you were learning how to drive? I don't know about you guys. I learned how to drive on a car that 7 other teenagers had learned how to drive on. So it was pretty much a wreck by the time I got it. And it was an auto stick. Like, you didn't actually have a clutch, but you shoved in the stick shift, and that was the clutch. They don't make them for a reason. And I remember driving, and I could not figure out how to turn the volume down on the radio, use the turn signal, and shift the car at the same time. It was like my head exploded. And now sometimes I drive home from work, and I don't actually remember doing it. You know what I mean? And I'm pretty sure I use my turn signal because I'm kind of anal about it, and I spend a lot of time in the Midwest where people actually use it and it means something, as opposed to in California where it's like inciting them to drive faster and not let you in. And I really think that if you remember that your teenagers are experiencing this for the first time, and you remember how first experiences are the ones that shatter your structure a little bit more, it will really help you in understanding why they can't use the skills that you think are so easy to utilize. Now, 17 to 18-year-olds, girls are actually decreasing their lability and their intensity, and they can often be less moody, they can be more engaging, kind, and my favorite, generous. Generosity in late adolescent girls is wonderful because it's a true generosity. It's not the 4-year-old who gives you their teddy bear because the teddy bear makes them feel better. It's them actually doing something. And parents often say things like, "We had a real conversation." And I always say it's correlated with a mix of suspicion and surprise when she cooks dinner without being asked. This is where they're actually learning what it is that you want or need and responding to it. And while girls are improving that way, boys are actually still continuing to become more intense in their emotions. They're actually continuing to experience greater anger, and there's also continued greater risk-taking and impulsivity. So it's like they've often forgotten the rules. And as much as I'm not sure what's going on with him captures it, I think what captures it even better is that it's correlated with speeding tickets. You should not be surprised if your adolescent male child who's an otherwise good driver when you're in the car with them comes home having done really radically stupid things in the car. There's actually a reason why we don't let adolescents drive with peers in their car for more than a year, and that's called teenage boys. Their IQ drops about 50 points when another person with testosterone gets in the car with them. And I really mean that. And there's a real reason why you're not allowed to rent a car until you're 25. Emotional development in 19 to 24 years of age is increasing maturity, steadiness. They're much less dysregulated, but for girls, you may see greater dysregulation within the sphere of a romantic relationship. I don't think there's anybody that you want to date less than a 19 to 24-year-old girl. And right, this is where all men get this idea that women are crazy and illogical and don't work well. And so you may see greater stability in relationships with friends and family and more dysregulation in romantic relationships. And they're nearing their adult levels of motivation and impulsivity. So they're actually able to entrain, and that's actually probably why girls do a little bit better with secondary education than boys do, is cognitively and emotionally and socially, they seem to be a little bit more ready for it. Where for boys, what you see is a greater interest in others and improved conversational abilities. And what I really mean by that is at some point your male child will go on a date with someone and you'll be like, what do you guys talk about? And they'll be like, we talk about everything. I mean, we talk about politics and sports, and you're like, with him? What you see is they continue to have higher levels of impulsivity and risk-taking behaviors well into their 20s, although it starts to level off at about 21. And by 25, they have more adult levels of motivation and impulsivity. But motivation for males at this age is easily derailed by what we call high-reward behaviors, sex, sleep, and video games being the best examples. In other words, while they may have the ability to manage their emotions, if there's a highly salient reward, they will lose it and go that direction, where girls stop doing that at about 17 or 18. So whatever. What do we need to do? And the point I really want to take home, and then I'll finish up, is communication. As our children turn into teenagers, we think they're the ones who change in their ability to communicate with us. We think they're the ones who are driving the greater distress and disagreements that we have. But parents are actually the ones who become more negative in their language and communications. When our children are really little, everything's positive. You know, how big is Alex? So big, right? And that's like a good thing. If your 15-year-old came home and did that, you'd be like, what's wrong with you? What we lose, actually, over the course of adolescence is not just positive communication, but neutral communication. Parents of teenagers don't have a lot of communication about, hey, did you see that article in the newspaper? Or, do you want to go get your nails done? Instead, it's, have you cleaned your room? Did you finish that assignment? Where are you going this weekend? Why won't you talk to me? I hate it when you do that. We actually need to improve our relationships by introducing more neutral communication between parents and children. And neutral meaning neutral coming from you. You don't get to control what they come back with, right? Because I certainly know a lot of teenagers where if you're like, hey, did you see the paper? No, I didn't. Why do you keep asking me? I don't read the paper. That's for old people. That's why God invented the iPad, right? And you're like, okay, just meant it neutrally. It's about finding the things you can have a conversation about that don't get upset and don't get your kids upset. And we struggle just as much as they do with the shifting balance of power in our household. We struggle because the child we knew is changing and they're wanting to meet us more as equals when, quite frankly, they don't have the wisdom or experience to do that. But sometimes we kind of want to meet them as equals, right? And usually the things we really want from our adolescents are exactly the things they don't want to do. I would love it if my 16-year-old would come home and do the laundry, but I have to tell you, I have a 50-year-old at home and he doesn't do it either. And so sometimes we have to be a little bit more realistic about the kinds of things that we're asking for. We also struggle as parents with control versus autonomy. And by autonomy, what I mean are independent skills, right? Being able to drive means you can do things for yourself, versus independence, which is more of a cognitive concept. I am different from you. I feel differently from you. I don't share your beliefs. One of the hardest things about adolescence is our children reject our beliefs and our values, right? Have you noticed that? And even if they're not rejecting our beliefs and our values, they're choosing an expression of our beliefs and our values that like poke us just a little bit. And that's actually something we struggle with as well, because if you're raising a child, you want to raise a child who can think and feel for themselves, right? And then they think and feel for themselves and you're like, not that way. If we recognize that what they feel is the parallel to what we are feeling, I think we'll be better in our communication with them. Recognizing that we want the same goals as they do. We just want them to put the adult part before the adolescent part, and they have to put the adolescent part before the adult part. So I love this one. Mom, are you talking back to me? Well, yeah, that's kind of how communication works. Sometimes we forget and we listen to how something is said rather than what is said. And that's a big mistake we make with teenagers. Teenagers are the masters of personally violent communication that you actually agree with. I can't tell you how often I have families in my office where they're in what I call violent agreement. And how about this one? I don't hate you, I'm just not necessarily excited about your existence. Teenagers need families who can tolerate the distress of being rejected. You know why? Because they've felt rejected. They have to reject you. If they don't reject you in some way, they're not going to be able to become not you. And I don't care how much you like yourself, your kid should not develop into you. Because you're doing a pretty good job already and there's not a lot of room for them to shine. Don't take personally the rejections of yourself that come from an adolescent. Recognize that they are keying in on your vulnerabilities and amplifying them back to you. How about this one? We do this a lot because communication decreases with our adolescents, so we try to use any time that they're talking to us as an opportunity to teach them. It is not funny. Telling your parents something funny, but then it turns into a life lesson, This is what I mean by neutral communication. If your child tells you something funny, laugh. That's what you would want someone to do with you. And if you find the desire to be like, well, you know why that's not funny though, is because if you did that, you could lose a limb, and I know they've made great strides in adding in prosthetic devices, but if you lost a limb, you wouldn't be able to do this, and you wouldn't be able to do that. First of all, sometimes I think we get so into it, we forget we were just having a conversation with our child about what their life would be like with a prosthesis. Those are the kinds of battles that we should probably wait until they happen before we have that conversation. I use sarcasm instead of punching you in the face. Don't push it though. Our adolescents use language in order to share an emotion with you. I can't say that more strongly. When you're talking to your adolescent and they change your feelings, you are not crazy. You are being a sponge to their lightning rod. Adolescents do one thing wonderfully, and that is they transmit their emotions. So what you are feeling, that frustration and intolerance and strong desire to run out of the room and slam the door in their face, is what they're allowed to do that you're not, and it's how they're feeling. And when you connect with that, you're like, okay, here's where you need some better skills. You can't do that anymore. And the don't push it though is because remember, they're not as skilled as you are. They still have more energy, but sometimes people are asleep at the wheel. Violence is never the answer. I would never let one of my teenagers punch anybody, but I think it's important. The other thing is, remember, you've learned all the skills that you're trying to give them, and they wish they had the power to ignore you the way you might ignore them. Adolescents want to be seen. They just don't want to be seen for any of their vulnerabilities, inconsistencies, things they don't like about themselves, areas where they might be weak or not great. They want you to see them and accept them and practice that non-judgmentalness because they don't have the skills that you have. And I really love this one. Horror movies don't scare me. 5 missed calls from mom scares me. I know a lot of teenagers, probably more than you'll ever have in your houses, thank goodness, unless you're on a TV show. No, I still know more than they do. And what I'm going to tell you is, I've really never met a teenager who truly rejects what their parents have to say, no matter how difficult they are making your life right now in this moment. What they really are doing is trying to find ways to balance their independence with these things. And they are still tied to you, because if your phone call can scare them this way, then it's because they're still connected to you. Never forget the power that your love has for your children. And never forget that your expectations are some of the most important expectations. Yes, they will try to dig under every rule that you have, but 5 missed phone calls from mom scares me because it means one of 2 things, right? Something bad happened or you're in deep shit. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions about teenagers and adolescents. Just remember that I'm painting with broad brush strokes here, because if I got into the range of adolescent development, we'd be here all night. Yeah.
So much.
Thanks.